No idea. Make no mistake, the site on Richard Farr's farm is extremely important. This is mainly because in the past 7 years the project has been galvanised by the discovery of the substantial and long-lasting pre-Roman presence on the site. Very little is known as to Bronze Age and Iron Age settlements in Cheshire. The discoveries at Poulton are unique to the county and will undoubtedly help rewrite and further the understanding of prehistoric Cheshire, and I would say elsewhere. So we're doing the archaeological site at Poulton, which has been being excavated. Leave that out because I want a little look in the break. Which has been excavated since 1995. And I will interject there that we were on the excavation on the weekend at Trellick. And other than one member of the Trellick excavation gang, it was the 6 of us involved, except loads of people dropped out. One with carpal tunnel syndrome on his wrist. Mm-hmm. I had that in a text. One with a badly injured leg. Mm-hmm. 2 decided to go off fishing. So it left a motley band. And those that may be interested in coming along to the excavation, the area that we were excavating will be continued. So when we do the Archaeology of Trellick, which will be in 3 weeks' time, you can handle all the artefacts that we excavated that day.
You thought you'd take them away?
Well,
He doesn't know.
no, because I'm an archaeologist and I've got to write a report on it. They are my possessions and I've done so. So there you go. Because the area that we were excavating, I was doing the everything. So anyway, Stuart was there, sat on his seat, talking to members of the public, and I was with my little gang. So Poulton. The one thing I've been trying to do is, by looking at these individual sites, is looking at various different archaeological techniques and various ways of discovering archaeology, various different periods in time. That's why you've got your sheet. And it's to sort of give an overview to greater and bigger things in the not so distant future. So, Poulton itself in Cheshire, to give you an idea where this site is, we will directly look at, there it is. It is to be seen there. So you've got Liverpool, North Wales, Poulton, Cheshire, and it's a site probably none of you will have heard of, but they've been excavating since 1995. Lots of Roman remains there, lots of medieval stuff, lots of prehistoric, very little modern. It's a site where they're still trying to find a large Roman villa complex. It's also a site that's been part of a number of television articles on Meet the Ancestors. A time team excavated there as well. And they're also trying to find the lost abbey of the Cistercian order that disappeared there in the 1540s as well. Poulton.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it spelling.
Poulton. So lots of notes to sort of get my eyes into today. So I'm going to read them first. So, searching for the buried past of Poulton. In 1995, the local farmer was looking in the field. Richard Farr, when they were looking in the field, they found a Roman floor tile in 1995, and this is an interesting integration between archaeologists and farmers, where farmers see archaeology as relevant and archaeologists see farmland being relevant. That's why I'm working with the Royal Agricultural University at this minute on PhD work, because they've decided to set up an archaeological department that's looking at the importance of archaeology within a farming landscape. It's taken a long time to get there, but lots of farmers do appreciate having archaeology on their land, as opposed to those archaeologists who come on to land, schedule a site to be an ancient monument, and the farmer is no longer allowed to do any work there. So it's that integration where the two need to work together to protect the past, rather than the past to be derided and destroyed by farmers in the first place. So, at the site of Poulton itself, in a National Farmers Union article from 2013, they discovered 757 sets of human remains. Each human remain is removed off site and then brought directly on site, approximately reburied in the location that was discovered in the first place, which is a big plus for me. Work being undertaken at the site after examination by students is being done by John Moores University. For those that know anything about universities, that's a high scientific based university. The University of Liverpool, that have been excavating on the site, alongside a certain Mr. Emery. And Mr. Emery is directly related to a family of actors and explorers, the Fiennes family.
Richard.
Yes.
Dickonry.
I
That's
was
what I just
thinking
said,
that.
Richard.
I was thinking that coming over this.
Moving on! So, archaeologists were invited onto the site. We invited the team in 1995. I do the jokes, but obviously it's not happening today. We invited the research team to investigate one of our fields where we'd found a number of medieval artefacts and human bones. Archaeologists confirmed then what the Farr family had been finding, and they had always believed that their fields were once an area rich in history and possibly a sacred landscape. So the archaeology on the site that we now know to 2019, they are working there in 2019 to this day. Today they are working there on the site, like all the other sites that we've been looking at. And so far they have found a medieval chapel with up to 2,000 sets of human remains associated with it, dating back before the Norman bloody conquest of Britain after 1066. So we're talking about sort of an Anglo-Saxon background for it. The chapel was abandoned in the 1600s. And why was it abandoned in the 1600s? Because of a slow decline within the landscape. The chapel was no longer frequented by local farmers, and therefore there was not enough to keep the site going. It was abandoned in the 1600s, but after 400 years it's been rediscovered. They are finding bits of the lost abbey and grange dating back to the 1100s, that horrible Cistercian order from France. It was quite interesting. I'll interject that on Friday, having 50 people there, having a go at them all, saying, why haven't any of you realised that we used to have our own monasteries in this landscape before the Normans wiped them all out? So this abbey and grange, does it have earlier origins than the Cistercian monks that come over from France? Lots more is to be learnt. A medieval hall dating back to the 1300s, a large amount of Roman pottery, tile, brooches, coins, building materials, roof tile, window glass, dating from about the 900s all the way to the end of Roman rule in about the AD 450s or somewhere thereabouts. Iron Age pottery, a Bronze Age cemetery, so we've got more cemetery stuff there. We've got a Neolithic timber henge circle, which we will have a look at today, dating back to 5,000 years ago. And you can use your sheet to work out the dates, and the Mesolithic flint tools dating back to as far back as 9,000 years ago. So this site has had a continuity all the way through the ages, like any rich, integral landscape that archaeologists are studying today. And it was so wonderful listening on the radio today to Francis Pryor. Well, they had a voiceover for him, and it was just like thinking, everything this man says is exactly what I said. Francis Pryor was also in the ilk that there was no bloody conquest of Britain in most periods of history. But that's another... so the Romans are not to be blamed for many of the horrible atrocities that they're blamed for. The aim of this project itself is very much to continue to understand a lost archaeological landscape, which is in itself, as I've been saying, also in the present. And with all that said, the abbey that was established in 1153, they are still wishing to find the guts of it. So in other words, this is, when I say the guts of it, we mean the big structures that are associated with the Cistercian Abbey. They're still trying to find it alongside the Roman villa. And why would they have missed a whole abbey and a Roman villa on such a large landscape of Poulton, which they're finding a large plethora of archaeology today? Why would they lose all that? Well, in fact, I was standing in a field packing up on Sunday, and I was thinking, the very site that we've been working on for the past 2 days, I'm looking out across the landscape, and you're looking out across most of the hinterland, there's absolutely nothing. And you stand there thinking, in the 1300s, this was the biggest city outside London in the whole of Britain, and there's absolutely diddly squat here. So it makes you wonder what's under our feet that has been lost over time. Lots of things are still to be discovered. Mike Emery, the archaeologist who's responsible for the excavation work at the site, with his rich family backing his work, and like most archaeologists working on a site like this, like Vindolanda or Sledgeford or Binchester, or even the Ness of Brodgar, these sites are opportunities. Sites such as this one only appear once in a lifetime. Because in other words, this is something that Mike Emery can retire upon. But I'm not telling you about my own little plans at this moment. Mike Emery himself says also, I believe this to be a sacred site all the way through the ages, and as a focal or gathering point in pre-Christian times. Simply put, it's a place of our ancestors. Perhaps it was a place where they celebrated weddings and christenings. And when he used the word sacred site, he's not necessarily referring to religious or sacred or votive. He's referring to the very basis of being a sacred landscape, being a landscape that lived and breathed through the ages. Voila! I may enlarge. Wonderful sets of human remains. An intact set of human remains, indicating as well that the agriculture, you don't have to chuck money at me yet, Keith, indicating that the agriculture itself hasn't destroyed many sets of these human remains. There is one set of human remains of a stillborn child that is absolutely fascinating from the site, an area of archaeology that we wish not to talk about, but what they found by the delicate work of the archaeologists, their understanding the medieval mindset, which is all important. So here we go. I'll keep this information up there, but you're not going to be able to read it. The medieval skeletons on the site give us valuable information. Skeletons do offer an understanding of the past, what their diet was like, when people have died, how old they lived, what agricultural life was like, and so on and so on. Whether they were involved in some kind of conflict, whether they were disabled or not. Tons of domesticated animal remains suggest this area has been a thriving farming community with stable farming practices taking place. I will interject on something that Francis Pryor would say. Seeing that it was fresh off the radio this morning, I thought I'd check this in there. Quote Francis Pryor, when it's still fresh, that there is very little sign that we've been overtaken by large waves of invasion. Because when you look at the landscape, what you see is continuity of place within the landscape, where farming has continued through generation after generation with very, very little change. Therefore indicating that this was not such a brutal takeover of the people, but just an integration of many people coming over from the continent at different times in history. Growing crops may have been a little more difficult for these people at the site as time came on, because it was intense agriculture. So parts of the landscape were handed over to burial and various other living sites. The archaeologists at the site frequently come across Roman floor tile fragments, window glass, fine pottery which suggests a high status Roman villa or building is lurking close by the site. in amongst the Roman artefacts. A cheese press from that age has also been found. So what we're talking about very nearby to Poulton. They had a large Roman site. There was just simply muck spreading, and that from that muck you glean the sense and the idea of a very important Roman site very nearby. Mr. Emery believes the site ceased to be a thriving farming community when the land came into the possession of the Duke of Westminster's estate. So that's going to be, I think, sometime in about the 1540s when the land was handed over to the landed gentry, which was a good thing after the dissolution of the monasteries. The redistribution of wealth from these fat monastic granges.
So a few fat rich people. Great.
Yeah, exactly.
And then from the fat rich people, they're now distributed to the vulgaris. I will remind you, Kathy, that we were only able to have a civil war which was protracted over a number of years because those individuals fighting the civil war in the main were not the rich landed gentry. It was the poor vulgaris at the bottom who were able to arm themselves with money that they were paid for working off the landscape, which they wouldn't have had hitherto before the dissolution of the monastery, and they were able to arm themselves. So the dissolution of the monasteries, I believe, was a very good thing. Moving on. And at the end of the day, the other thing as well is the land that had been given to the church was redistributed to those people who had given it to the church in the first place. Vis-a-vis is a good thing. I love saying things to wind people up. The law, where the law comes in with human remains, and particularly when it winds Kathy up. Have you noticed she hasn't realised that Ellen's not in the room yet? For sites such as the one at Richard Farr's farm, where the burial ground has fallen into disuse and the burials are all over 100 years old, require a licence from the Ministry of Justice. Before you can excavate any human remains. The archaeologists have had such a licence there since 1995, and it's renewed every 5 years. Sometimes it's not possible to get a licence to recover human remains, particularly when the human remains are directly under threat when they're being discovered along our wonderful coastline. So those human remains have to be removed by the archaeologists for safekeeping, and then retrospective permission is given. Moving a next little bit about archaeology and sort of legislative sort of background stuff. To undertake dating on one set of human remains costs about £400. So you can imagine trying to get the dating on all these hundreds of sets of human remains is very difficult. So you bring a university in, they pay for all the dating and stuff because it assists their students, and that's a good way of doing it. Using students to gain an idea of sex, height and age is also good for their training. What happens with when the bones have been analysed, DNA taken, they are reburied mainly back on site. Some of the sets of human remains at the site have been found in duality graves, where there's more than one person in any grave. When the research and teaching activities, they are reburied very close to the site where they were excavated. We always remind ourselves that it is a privilege, an honour, to be allowed to excavate and examine the remains of another human being. At the end of the day, they were once like us. It is our duty to rebury them in the Christian manner and environment, whether they were Christian or not, in which they expected to stay when they were first interred in the cold clay of Poulton. When you find human remains beyond about 200 years ago, 99% of them are going to be Christian from this land anyway. So they're buried in a Christian manner. Right, one thing that we very, very rarely talk about. Reconstruction archaeology. Why is reconstruction archaeology important? Well, we'll see how important reconstruction archaeology is when we look at the Butzer Iron Age and Roman project in the south of England. But it's also very important at sites such as Poulton. They haven't actually done a reconstruction of a building at the Nest yet, but I'm sure they'll get around to it sometime. This building itself, as you can tell, is an Iron Age roundhouse. And I want to reiterate how important reconstruction archaeology is. And I've mentioned this before. For those that haven't heard, I will repeat it again. There was this one individual when he was sleeping away in the reconstructed building at Butser, with a load of chickens and goats in the building. The reconstruction archaeologist, he thought, right, I'll see how these buildings work, right? So he had to keep the fire going throughout the night. And as dawn approached, he couldn't work out why all the chickens were huddling into the doorway area. Let's go back a step. Whenever archaeologists excavated a roundhouse, they always thought that the depression in the doorway area, the only threshold into the building, they always thought that the doorway area was because of wear on the surface, so it's going to be naturally worn. And other archaeologists have interpreted that hollow, as you go into a building, as being drip, as it came down from the roof into that area. Other people have interpreted it as something to wash your feet as you go into a building. Don't ask. Other interpretations have been varied and mixed. Well, this archaeologist, the place that warms up the quickest away from the fire is the threshold, because that's where the air is flowing in and out. So that's going to be the area it's going to be dry. The chickens are not going to congregate around the fire because it's going to be too hot. And then they found that, then he was looking and he thought, hang on a minute, that hollow that we deliberately put in there because we thought it was for something else, the chickens are having a dust bath in it. And they're having a whale of a time. And he watched these for a whole hour, and then the archaeologist suddenly realised that the reason why you've got a depression in the threshold is an indication that you kept chickens. Because chickens love a good old dust bath, particularly at dawn. And how would I know? Well, I got enough of them. So chickens seem to congregate in a depression, right? I say I reward them occasionally. I get the rake in there and I rake up a load of earth and dig up a load of earth and stuff. And they have a load of worms, right? And in that depression that is so formed, the chickens just dive in there and they roll about as having a dust bath. Reconstruction archaeology is important, therefore, to understand how these buildings worked. Without understanding how these buildings worked, we've got no idea what the interpretation of the archaeology could possibly ever be. So we reconstruct these buildings. Initially, the first reconstructions of these buildings was that you can see there that the guy is slightly above the pseudo-lintel area of the entrance into the building. Well, initially, when they were building these structures, they made two mistakes. They put an exit in the roof, so the smoke would go straight out. They thought, good idea. And what they then did, they actually had a lintel that was above the height of an individual going into a building. And they built these structures mainly in pine. 3 mistakes. Building these structures in pine is a really bad idea because pine decays quite rapidly. It absorbs moisture and it keeps moisture. So you don't build these structures using pine. First mistake. Having the smoke exiting out the roof, also the heat exits at the same time. Okay, so they remedied this. They thought we'll have a sealed roof, right? And then they worked out that the lintel was allowing all the heat to escape. So as you drop the lintel, it means that the heat is hovering around this level. So when you enter the building, the heat is hovering within the building and slowly making its way through the roof, very, very slowly. And the smoke makes its way through the roof and lines the timbers and doesn't decay them. All these things we've learned by reconstructing the past. I'm not going to be interested in that.
Quick question, Carl, on these houses. I've never seen a door in any of them. What do you think the doors are made of? Hide or wood or something?
Well, I think on that question the jury's out. Actually, we'll go back to that one. On that question, the jury's out. I was thinking that when when I just moved on to the next slide, I thought hopefully nobody's going to ask this question. Two answers to this, and I can't answer the third, right? So 2 out of 3 is good. One is that you never ever allow the entranceway to be exposed to the elements, right? Because you've got to keep the heat in there. The fire is kept going 24/7. So you cannot allow. You can see inside that building. That is wrong for a start. So the answer to the second question we don't think it's a proper doorway. So there's going to be some really heavy hide there. There's going to be some porch there as well, a really heavy hide, some really heavy material. The main thing is, secondly to that point, is that the whole point of this building is to keep you alive. And warmth is one of those important elements. And what we saw when I was looking at the buildings at Scatness on the island of Shetland was that the entranceways were fairly narrow, and the lintels were still on some of the stone buildings at Shetland dating back to this period. So you can tell the level, they're actually quite squatted down, giving rise to the myth that people in the past were short, when in fact the archaeological evidence doesn't tell us that. So I think that's 2 out of 3, yeah?
Yeah, that's cool.
We'll do that one. Right. Here we go. Here we go. What we'll do, what we're going to do, we'll have a break about 10 to 12. So that means that you can't leave. You've got to continue, and then we'll go on. That'll be good.
Cowbridge calls, I'm afraid.
Why did you admit that in this room? You've been lynched.
Bovium.
Bovium. Why are you going to Cowbridge?
Something to do with it.
I think MYOB comes into that sentence somewhere.
What does that mean?
Mind
your
your
own
own
business.
Oh! Oh, right, okay. Right. Shut up. Right, Samianware. An archaeological lesson again. One thing about finding this Samianware is unabraded. So when it's braided, it's been worn. It's quite sharp. So that means that when the muck was spread into that field, it's likely that the land was probably just ploughed that year and left to be made fallow for a few years. Hence, the pottery made its way into the soil, never damaged by ploughing. And again, this is in such a fine state of preservation. This Roman Samianware, itself proves categorically that there's a rich Roman building very nearby. You don't get Samianware like that for buildings that were lived in by plebs. History again of the site at Poulton, some bit of medieval archaeology, a bit of the excavation stuff. And I've got to be very wary today that we've got to have time to do these articles of the week, which we'll do directly after the break. So this is known as a multi-period archaeological site, a multi-period landscape. And chuck in something in here, a multi-period taskscape. And what a taskscape is that things are all mixed up and sort of intertwined, breathing and living. The hope was to find a settlement that was archaeologically rich over several periods, and that they have found. But obviously, naturally, deep focus into the landscape associated with the dissolution of the Cistercian Abbey. Not in 1540, it was one of the early ones. This was dissolved in 1534. And they've been excavating there year after year, that's the point, continuously year after year, working on the cemetery area. And this is where radiocarbon dating comes in. When you've got burials of an earlier date, you need to be able to work out they're from an earlier date, and not the date in the medieval period. So this is why everything's got to be radiocarbon dated. Radiocarbon dated, I'm reminded, is not 1,000,000% accurate. Radiocarbon dating can be within 50 or 250 years within the event that the person was buried.
Sorry?
Sorry.
There's a response to that.
No.
You're not supposed to be saying this.
No.
Kathy is. So whatever you do, don't
I did
take
check
over
with
the
her.
first.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I did. I did notice. Well done. Right. So when you look at this, and the other thing as well is when you look at a multi-period site, inevitably the archaeology is very mixed and churned up. So, for example, you've got a medieval burial that cuts through Roman layers, and you've got a void. And from that void where the burial goes in, all that material is brought to the surface, and then it's put back onto the body. So therefore you've got Roman material mixed in with the freshly buried medieval remains, which is difficult for a lot of people to work out. How can you have medieval stuff mixed up with Roman stuff? And then in turn, the Roman stuff in the Roman period, 1,700 years ago, they've cut into layers before. So they've done their ditches and they've done their burials and drainage ditches for housing and all the rest of it. So they've dug into prehistoric material, which mixes up with the Roman material, and then you go back into when they're digging the grave, all that's mixed up. So you can have prehistoric stuff on the surface alongside medieval stuff. And one thing that we were finding when we were excavating at Trellick on the weekend was it was quite interesting finding pottery from the late 1200s alongside pottery from the 1700s. And it was continually mixed up like that. This is the other point of having archaeology at a location like this. From 1999, involving universities, for training volunteers, which we've already mentioned, there are financial limitations in archaeology, but us archaeologists are getting very savvy. Lots of members of the public will pay up to £100 a day to be trained to work on our archaeological site. People will pay 550 quid to go on a ghost walk on a Friday, paying my wages for the next 2 weeks. So the fact of the matter is we've got to be very savvy, and we've got to make sure that if people are interested in history and archaeology, then we charge accordingly for our qualifications to teach them in the first place. Like this project, and Sedgeford, and Vinderlander to keep Vinderlander going, and so on, is to charge people appropriate rates to excavate on these sites. To excavate at Trellick, they charge £50 a day, for example. That means that you can pay archaeologists, therefore, to be on site, to invite schools along, and not to charge the schools when the archaeologists are being paid to do their work by people wanting to be trained. So that means that on the community level, nobody needs to be charged from the local community. Like the free service that a library is. The free service of a library is being paid for out of the taxpayer. So therefore people can get free access to books, people can get free access to the archaeology, and that's been paid for out of the work that the archaeologists are doing by charging members of the public to excavate there. So outreach lectures, children can go to the site and see what the archaeologists are doing, and there's going to be no expense to the school. This is the way things are going. So in other words, there is basically zero state funding to do archaeological work in this country today. Kathy?
What about the carbon dating of these bones?
Pardon?
What about the carbon dating of these bones?
That's being done by the universities.
Well, haven't they done any?
Yes.
Aren't you going to tell us?
Oh, that's coming up.
Well, you've been on your high horse for a bit. I thought I'd get you off it.
Oh, okay.
Getting nasty now.
It is getting nasty.
Fight,
Chris, can you
fight.
save me?
No, I'm not interfering. I value my life.
So the Poulton project has captured the imagination of many from all levels of society. But what is important, however, is to involve the whole community in a project that is expected to last many, many years. Because of the very nature of archaeology, many who would like to be involved become naturally excluded through no fault of their own. So by charging members of the public to excavate, as I said, it means that members of the public are able to watch what they're doing without being charged to see the results of that work. Access to the site is not necessarily difficult, but there is a need to provide special facilities for the needs of disadvantaged groups, both adults and especially children. The long-term goal is to establish a research and educational centre that they hope to do, for example, at Trellick and the Ness of Bodger. So if you look at old episodes of Meet the Ancestors, you'll see where they are at with the archaeological excavation there. During 2018, the Poulton Student Field School continued to investigate the burials of a medieval farming community interred within the chapel graveyard. Multiple skeletal remains, which is unusual. Man and woman buried alongside each other at the same time, the same date. As you are all aware, that when you go to a graveyard, very uneasy subject to talk about. When you go to graveyards, you find that when somebody's been with somebody a long time, not so long after their spouse passes away, what you usually see is you see this person died in 1824 on the 14th of March, and by the 16th of April, the other loved ones died, so they're buried alongside each other. And we do see this at Poulton. We do see this actually happening at the site. This is where we come on with the radiocarbon dating. Right, this is a stillbirth. And I know it's a subject that some of you would find very awkward. Very sad, very sad. But it's important to understand that people in the past had the same respect for their children as we do. I can remember my ex-wife. There were 2 occasions where things got really bad with the pregnancies, and you look back and you think, how would that child be now? What would they be like? And these people in the past had exactly the same feelings as we do, except up until recently, we don't see the remains of these individuals that were loved by our medieval ancestors. We do think always, and our mind is sometimes jaded, by references that we find in the Roman period. Not in Britain. Well, what we see is references by Roman writers, a baby dies, or somebody under about 2 or 3 years old, and they're just chucked into the rubbish heap. We read that, but that's not necessarily the case in our country, but that's the Roman period. We can't really help to give much answers there. But what we've got to look at is what was going on in the medieval period. And this is what we see associated with the chapel at Poulton. And that there, the child was actually buried in a wooden coffin, which was a very fine wooden coffin indeed. In fact, it was probably a box that the family had in the house. There was the stillbirth, and they decided to bury the child. Some very interesting issues associated with this. The radiocarbon dating, because it's a child's bones, they were only able to get, they know that the maximum limit of the radiocarbon dating is 1307. So the earliest possible date, the terminus post-quem is 1307, and the terminus ante-quem, which is the latest possible date, is 1421. So there's a big gap of 110 odd years that the child was buried, and because of the condition of the bones, it's very difficult to get radiocarbon dating material because of contaminants in the earth and so on. We do see that even though there was a rich agricultural landscape, sometime in the 1300s things got really bad. Things started to deteriorate quite rapidly. And what we mean by deteriorate quite rapidly is that in 1315 we do see that there is the start of the Great Famine and crop failures, all the way leading to the outbreak of the plague in England in 1548. And this body sort of could come into that, where the stillbirth may have been brought about, the premature birth, 2 weeks premature. They found out all this. And it was probably, maybe that could have been to do with diet. Disease and starvation, with the other graves that they've actually found, were constant threats in this uncertain time. And without the benefits of modern medicine and vaccination, from what's representative from the human remains on the site, 50% in this period in the 1300s, 50% of the population perished before the age of 18 years old. So it's important to understand, not just from an historical point of view, but the actual point of view of the population. And there's another point to be made here, if none of you can see it. With a declining population, it's no wonder that by the time that there's the outbreak of the plague in 1348, it's no wonder that there was a large population that was fairly mature, very vulnerable. There wasn't this dearth of children within families to look after the population. So by the time the plague hit, the population was hit by another factor of the population getting more mature and unable to fight these horrible outbreaks of plague that were occurring from 1348 onwards. Albeit there's many other causes. There's anthrax, there's poor diet, and so on. They found with across the site, within this site, not this body that we've just seen, but within this site, there's a large amount of children buried up to about the age of 4 years old. We don't usually see this in the archaeology. Last August, this is last year, however, we discovered a highly unusual baby burial. Not just for the site, but with few, if any, national parallels. Is buried in a coffin, which is very unusual in the medieval period. Those that know anything about people not being baptised or christened, I couldn't remember the word there. If you're not baptised or christened, you're not seen to be a child of God, and you're not to be brought into the church graveyard. You're seen to be damned. At the southern edge of the graveyard, just within the boundary, they found a set of skeletal remains in a well-organised fashion. There's some stuff about technique coming as well. As if sleeping, but within the remains of what was once a small oak box. Although the majority of the wood had long since decomposed, we've already seen that there's a little bit of a metal lock on there. Corner brackets and nails still survived. Over the course of 3 days, we carefully excavated a channel around the burial, wrapping it in bandages for support, and lifting the set of skeletal remains and the remains of the box in a block for transportation to Durham. Why do archaeologists do that? Well, you can't excavate a set of very delicate human remains out in the open for 2 reasons. You need to give the individual a sense of respect. You also need to take the individual away because the remains are so delicate, you've got to excavate them in a laboratory. So you've got a miniature excavation on a table within a laboratory. That's what we mean by that. And they undertook X-ray on it, micro-excavation of the human remains. They found out it was 2 or up to 6 weeks premature. Radiocarbon dating that we've already given it from 1307 to 1421, during the height of the graveyard's use. The question is, why would somebody bury a baby in such a manner? Why are we even asking these questions? But there's an important reason for asking those questions. I won't go into detail about the next because it's extremely upsetting, but I'll say that in about 1988 I was involved in an archaeological excavation at Cadoxton Church, and alongside the church, alongside the chancel of the church, outside was a set of human remains of a child, and there were sets of baby remains and stuff alongside the chancel wall with no markers, very close to the surface, and these had to be removed because of the path around the church. They needed to put footings in, because usually what happened would be late at night, a mother and a father would come into the church graveyard. The child hadn't been christened or baptised, and buried the child alongside the chancel wall to give them some hope that that they might find some kind of solace. They might be able to see them in the afterlife, because they're buried within hallowed and holy ground. The location of the body itself, found away from the church itself, which is again unusual, not in the context I've mentioned. If the baby was stillborn, they could not have been christened or baptised, and hence buried within the communal graveyard. They would instead likely have been placed outside the graveyard in an area put aside for unbaptised infants who would wait in limbo for the second coming. Parents did not want that. They wanted the children with them in the afterlife. It is therefore possible that the family didn't want the child to be buried in unconsecrated ground. So place the body in a conventionally sized household box, a valuable item to a peasant farmer, and snuck them in the graveyard under cover of darkness. The placement of the burial on the edge of the southern graveyard further supports the hypothesis, as the land drops away sharply in the area of the floodplain of the River Dee, 18 metres above the level of the church. So nobody would have been able to see them burying the box, but within hallowed ground. By approaching from this side, the family would have been provided with the natural cover required to conduct their clandestine interment. Hence, the body was buried in hallowed ground. And there it is. I think that's part of one of the clasps for the box itself. And you can see where you've got a wonderful set of ribs. That's going to be, if that's heading that way, that's going to be the tibia, and not the tibia. Yeah, the tibia and the fibula, isn't it? And you've got the femur further up. So you've obviously got the rib bones, and you've got the head up here. So what we're going to do now, we're going to take a break. I'm going to explain about these finds, because these finds were made on the 29th of June this year. So, any questions on that? I would like to make a few announcements. Right, obviously, Keith, make sure you pay up your Colchester dues soon.
Oh, I will.
Okay. Keith apparently owed some chocolate.
Right.
Yeah. As a raffle prize. We've done the lottery. I brought some milk in. Obviously, those that are now down for the Gower trip.
No, Gower. I got it confirmed. It's Gower.
When is the Gower?
Oh, Gower.
Gower.
Gower. Is that baby Gower? Please, sir.
You're absolutely right. You're right. He's wrong.
Visiting Cathole.
Hang on. How can the Gower be wrong from me and the Gower be right from her? That's just...
a Gower trip.
She's got a qualification. I mean,
Oh, well.
qualifies.
Do you know what, man? I've got qualifications about it. He just doesn't...
When is it?
And it's in
Can I just mention, right?
German.
Right, hang on. Why are her qualifications more relevant than mine? Is it because her university's better than my university?
Probably.
Never mind.
Gower is the adjective.
Oh God, what have I done? Right, anyway, so that's the 4th of August, which is a Sunday.
Yeah.
4th of August, and those that are going to, I do believe September is the Skenfrith and Grossmont trip. Any monies for that would be greatly appreciated. I'm going to go around now. We got duck eggs and whatever. So thank you very much, folks.
Okay.
Hang on. Can I ask that now? Right, that off.
Carl, are there any questions on the Gower?
Yes, there are.
Kettle
Right,
duty.
well, I have to
Sorry?
check my
Are you
calendar.
doing yours?
I am.
I'll get back to them on that.
I am.
All right then. What, the Gower trip or Gower trip?
Yeah, but it's the trip
To Gower.
to Gower.
That's
Yeah.
right.
I'm loving this today. Do you feel like Goth is in
I
I think they're getting rid of our teaspoons as well as...
Look, hang on, I can't be responsible for your teaspoons, right? I'm just...
I told
I think they're nicking things.
You go out for a 4-course meal, everything's organised right, and she wants more. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Mine were little. I ended up doing like
Please
5
do,
days
can I
a
have
week
some
nearly
Oh,
for free.
and now we get you.
We've already seen this image, really rich imported seimin ware. And again, unabraded, so it means it hasn't been ploughed up or damaged in the field. So you can get an idea of how things end up in the soil by the amount of wear on them, for example. Imported in from Gaul, and here we go. And it's talking about this is talking about a variety of finds from the 29th of June. So what they've got seimin ware that's been found, which isn't the ones you've just seen. This is referring, yesterday was amazing for Roman finds, as our features were crammed with a variety of material. There were also fragments of a Holt ware cooking vessel from Holt, which is in North Wales, dating to about the 100s. All in one area, all in a ditch. Fragments of pots, roof tile, animal bones, and they can't wait to refit it all together, including the seimin ware. And there you go, that's what they're up against. So they're working in this clay. This is the Holt ware here, the yellowy, the orangey stuff. Sort of all this is all made locally. Obviously the seimin ware is coming in from the continent. A very rich fines tray where they're hoping that some of the cooking pots will actually go together. It's beautiful having a rim of Roman pottery and actually putting it all together.
Okay, I'm off. Cheerio, everybody.
Yeah, off with you.
Cheerio.
See you next week.
Yeah.
You're off with you. Keith, look, say hello to Cambridge.
Wild horses would be taken to go.
Oh, it's great. And like tame ones.
I like all the different shops, the little shops there in Cambridge.
Yeah.
They're not, but I do like the varieties
It's
and
brown, it's
everything.
interesting brown.
Yeah.
The veils are good, like that, eh?
Yes.
I don't, I'm encouraged
I had to tell him his pants were hanging out.
Yeah, we heard.
Did you?
Yeah, we all did.
Right, so obviously trays of archaeology, painting that wonderful picture that this site is a multidisciplinary site. And Roman pottery, I love finding Roman pottery on archaeological sites. So here we go, a bit more about this is also from that article. We brought in a machine last week to extend Trench 48. The one with all the Roman ditches, and it is wall to wall in archaeology. And sometimes when you actually, this is a note. Sometimes when archaeologists are excavating on sites now, Facebook can be very useful in updating people on the latest finds. With the seimin ware, with the Holt ware itself, dating those very delicate layers to roughly around 100 years AD. And again, just to even things out, the chapel trench produced a flint core of the same period. Poulton just keeps giving. So one moment you've got a trench with Roman stuff in, another trench you've got medieval stuff, Oh, you've got prehistoric stuff over here. So it's wonderful having a multidisciplinary site like that. Oh, we were just finding nothing but medieval pottery on the weekend. But really nice medieval pottery. Isn't this unusual, this grave? I felt this was very, very strange. So what we're going to do, we're going to put this side on. So we get it a bit bigger. And if we sort of... Oh, it's a bit too big.
I probably thought something nasty.
So what we have, I'm just going to blatantly use lecturer's prerogative. Obviously small, so that's obviously a woman, and this is obviously the male. And what you can see here is that these two are buried at the same time. How can we know that they're buried at the same time? It's very easy to work that out. Because if this person's interred first, as they're digging the trench up again to put the person alongside it, it would undoubtedly cause damage to the side of this individual in digging the trench. So this would indicate firmly that these two people were buried more or less at the same time, without any decomposition of the other individual. So as they're digging down, we've got the person in a shroud. Let's bury the person alongside it, because naturally, with putrefaction in the ground and shrouds, everything rots away quite quickly, and there's a great deal of decay, disarticulation. You dig another hole in there, you can disturb the bones. So these are buried together. So it's interesting getting a multiple grave like this.
The pelvic notch tells us that it's a woman as well.
Yes. And you can also tell as well that there's a spinal defect. So this person's got scoliosis as well, or some kind of curvature like that as well. So it's a really good state of preservation that these remains are in. And it's all there. The rib bones, the phalanges, the humerus, the femur, it's all there. The spinal column as well. And arms folded as well. Folded. You can tell that this event is more or less at the same time, because they're buried in exactly the same way, tightly up against each other. So whatever they died from, it's unlikely. It's unlikely that these people have died from something like a plague outbreak. Because if they died from something like a plague outbreak, plague graves go in 3 categories. Plague hits, people are buried individually. Next stage of plague, they're buried in a long row. 3rd stage of plague, they're just tossed into a hole in the ground. So probably work out that that's not sort of plague related, but they may have died of something that was quite contagious, and they went at the same time. And again, I know I probably overdid it earlier on about paying for archaeology and stuff, but it's good for people to get an idea, because archaeology, obviously my income strain comes in last year I did some contractual work on an archaeological site, obviously do this. Obviously, other income streams that I get in, that sort of pays my wages. It's because of these people charging people to excavate at the site that these other people are able to come in and to observe the archaeology. They're not charged to observe the archaeology. So it all works nicely. If people are prepared to pay for something, then let them pay for something. It keeps things going. That's the point I was trying to make. And again, you're able to see this today. Thanks to all that process, you're able to see this work. Involving university students, you're able to see all this going on. Jane, you can't go yet.
I'm not going.
Good. So what we've got as well is that this site itself, there's our site at Poulton. Give you an idea, it's a very rich landscape, but it's fairly countrified, that they're able to continue working on the archaeology. There's our roundhouse, very, very large roundhouse indeed. Again, the experimental sense of what's going on, and one of the big things that I was talking with Stuart, the manager of the excavation at Trellock on the weekend, is that when people have got excavations like this, it's a very rare opportunity to actually connect. I know you're connecting with what I'm saying to you in the room through the archaeology, but actually seeing the archaeology is a different thing altogether. The aerial view of the excavations, and some archaeology has been backfilled to protect it. Obviously the burial area that's been excavated, you can just backfill that, and then when the bodies come back on site, rebury them nicely. I really like that approach. Student excavations, obviously you can see what's going on there, but one thing that's interesting to me is that the archaeology that they're working on isn't a great distance from the surface. In some areas it's well under 0.5 metre, in other areas it's 1 metre, but that build-up itself has naturally protected the archaeology that we're looking at today. One thing in archaeology is that when you're excavating, the archaeology needs to be particularly protected. So one technique that I use in particular is to cover up an excavation. So as you're excavating, the moisture isn't evaporating too quick, so you can actually see what's going on. One problem because we were a small team on the weekend. I remember no sooner as people had been excavating, the surface had dried out, so you had to try and reinterpret what was going on. But with a cover like that, you're able to work on the archaeology, keep the moisture in the soil, you're able to understand it, particularly in relation to delicate areas when you're working on human remains. Right, let's get your thinking caps out. Well, you can work out that that's a circle around the outside. So I want your thinking caps out, and maybe, to give you an idea of scale, I mentioned what this is at the beginning. That's a wheel. So this is quite a large monument. Not going to give you any other information. What could this be?
Wheels, did you say that was?
That's a tyre, so it gives you an idea of scale. That's to protect whatever's there. This itself is a henge monument. A henge monument is when you create a ditch all the way around the outside, and the soil is upturned inside. You can see a faint bank there, and over the years, as the landscape's been ploughed, all the soil makes its way into the ditch. And this is from the prehistoric period. This is from the Neolithic period, dating back 5,000 years ago, and maybe before this. This may, indicated by these post holes around, may have been a causewayed enclosure site where bodies would have been exposed. And what there were ditches, bank. You can basically see that there. And so this was beyond about 5,000 years ago. And then they decided to make this into a henge monument, getting rid of these bits in between. And lo and behold, henge monument. It's still there today, so they've excavated it. And when we start to try to understand, again, multidisciplinary landscape, again, another scene of excavating there, and this gives you an idea of scale of this henge monument. What are we seeing with the henge monument? Well, what we're seeing with the henge monument is that you've got the ditch around the outside. These bits here are something called sections. You keep a section because when you want to read down, you can read the layers. Because when you take everything out of a ditch, everything's jumbled together and it loses its context. But you can work out over different periods of time that there's been different levels of deposition, from the earliest silting up of this ditch all the way through to deliberate destruction and demolition and the backfilling of the ditch. What we might find here as well is something known as iron panning. An iron panning would discolour. What happens is you've got roots and stuff of turf being covered up by soil, and the what's called iron sesquioxide building up in that soil to sort of create a discoloration, and a pan of iron is created across the site, sort of natural iron spread across the site. That's called iron panning. Natural iron, because when mineralisation and things can occur naturally, this is what iron panellings, areas of burning. So archaeologists can learn a lot from this site. Again, giving you an idea of scale. This isn't a small site at all. Just a few more bits of information, and then we'll call it a day. Wonderful image at the end. Several, actually. So in conclusion, we've got a site that's over 10,000 years old. They're getting close to understanding the Cistercian and the outlines of the abbey. They haven't exactly found it yet, but they've got the medieval chapel associated with it. 2,000 burials over different periods. A farming landscape. A ritualistic landscape as well. A variety of goods representative of all these periods. If anyone wants to go and excavate on the site, it's £200 a week, and you've got to excavate there for a minimum of 2 weeks. No accommodations provided, no food or anything. You're there to be trained in excavation techniques, plans, section drawing, context recording, photography, finds processing and surveying, and all that excess money is used to continually to preserve the site, and archaeological finds cost money to keep. You can't just put things in a box and expect that it's going to be there, and you don't have to pay for that. So this is some of the offsets of what this money's exactly used for. Just take a note of something. Okay. If any of you do get an opportunity to go to a site like this, again, a nice little box of Roman material. So this would be up your street, Alan. So maybe you should get up there next year. Try and book to get involved in the archaeological excavation. So just look at a tray like that, you can tell that the ditches and the holes in the ground are full of unabraded pottery. Unabraded pottery. It means that it hasn't been moved around, it's just been dumped in the soil. Landfill spread on the field. You've got black burnished ware there. I haven't got that clear enough, but that looks like the Holt wares that we've been mentioned. You've got Samian, which we mentioned earlier on. All this type of material. And there was also a very soft, creamy, white type of pottery as well that was also produced in the Roman period that, with a blink of the eye, sort of looks like porcelain, but it isn't. And look at that. Ooh! Now,
Bit of a mixture.
without shouting at once, knowing what you do know, what does this illustration or this photograph portray?
We've all died of something.
No. It's something, there's a specific name for this hole in the ground where there are a load of bones together.
Like a mass burial?
Close, what's the name for it?
Pit.
Something pit?
Pit.
No. Channel pit. Channel, play pit, something different there where you're going to find the more articulators who jumped in the ground. It's a channel pit. What usually happens, you have a channel house, yeah? And when people, I don't know if any of you were with me on the trip to Llantwit last year. We went to the church graveyard. And at the back of the church graveyard, I said, oh, let's go and all have a look for some pottery. And there was one or two, what's this human rib bone standing here? And I said, oh, God, no. They just freshly dug up a grave and there was all these human bones on the surface there. That in times gone by, all those human bones would be put together and put in the channel pit. Okay, that's what they used to do in the past. When you're digging freshly out of the ground, you get all these bones of other previous graves and they go in a channel pit. This is what this is, it's a channel pit. So this could have been used for over 600 years, where bones of different individuals, even from earlier, there's going to be bits of Bronze Age human remains here, bits of Roman bones from the 1400s, all in a channel pit mixed together. So this is what this is. Strangely enough, associated with a set of human remains that's basically alongside it. So, so the channel pit I can't really work out what's going on, but that doesn't seem to be disarticulated. So at one point they thought, right, we'll put a human being on top of the channel pit, right, and that sealed it off forever. But anyway, that's another interpretation. But this is what this is, a channel pit. We do believe we've got one more image, and amazing enough. Oh, there I go, teaching in a local school. Here we go. This is. I'm going to finish with this image, but basically the Poulton chapel excavation, archaeological excavation. The beautiful chapel there once was demolished and closed 1600s. And this was part of the Time Team broadcast in 2007, filmed in 2006. And if we look at this a bit more clearly, and this is the point of archaeology, most of this, you can imagine that actually you can see that there's very little topsoil there over this, but there's very little archaeology as well. And that might explain why they're really struggling to find the abbey associated with the chapel and the landscape. Although the remains are there, traces of those remains might be very faint. And that's why they're struggling finding those remains. But I'm sure they will eventually find the remains of the abbey. Large complex, but I'm sure they'll find Poulton Abbey one day. It's the same about the elusive set of Roman remains as well. They will find those Roman remains one day at Poulton. On that note, amazingly enough, it's 12:29. Are there any questions?
Was there a little town there as well, or not, or just the abbey?
It would have been the abbey. That was the hub. But the medieval, just before the medieval period, there was probably a settlement there, and then you got the settlement in the Roman period, and you got settlement in time. So people have been there for up until about 400 years ago, and then now it's in other words, people have been there for a long time because it's still an agricultural landscape. So people have never really left the landscape.
You mentioned it was 757.
757 at the beginning, but now it's about 2,000 sets of human remains.
How much of that is Roman? Roughly.
Well, you need to go on site to work out how many sets of those human remains are actually Roman or not.
I mean, a lot.
Don't know.
Very nice.
Any other questions, folks? Okay, if there's no more questions, anyone wants to chat, I want a quick look at that. I've got to go get your eggs, Peter.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming today. Are you all here next week?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
For the wall.
Good. Good. Free. Alan, don't put that away. Kathy, I haven't finished my tea yet, so don't take it.
See you, folks.
Thanks everybody.
Last week.
Yeah, I'm part next to you in the car park
It's
afterwards.
got to be.
Oh yeah. Oh, I
Yeah, I'm trying to put this back.
Oh,
Mix them up or
God.
something.
Oh, don't.
I don't know what it was, but it was like
Oh, I've had a nightmare. I had to have my medication changed. It's kind of medication
That's not sealed,
Okay.
by the way.
Take, you can't just sit there and not have it out.
Yeah, I know, the work takes down.
So they said that they will send to my doctor.
Somebody's put a dirty teaspoon in the mug again. I wish. No.
So
I'm tempted to just
I'm
chuck
looking
his
forward
cup.
to the
Contents.
Because
Yeah.
and then eventually,
It's the coffee that needs time.
Yeah.
and it gets to the
That's
day
all
when
we
you're
need.
gone. I went back to the
Oh,
doctor.
is this as well?
Yeah.
Oh yes, they have.
And that as well.
So
Well, how
they
are you
have to
supposed to
give
get
you
it all
some
in
little
there?
extra bits and
Just do that to annoy
Stop
you.
The
it.
GP can't prescribe them unless.
You might be able
So
to.
they'll be into a sort of thing.
Well, those biscuits.
I'll finish them then. I'll finish them then.
I'm going to finish it. Or is that a different thing?
There's a different one.
Put you go with that box.
He said he'd bring a jam jar, so of course I didn't bring them.
Who's bringing a jam jar?
He's obviously forgotten.
Have you got the milk? Oh, they'll fit in, I think. Have you got the coffee maker?
That's why I didn't, because I'm a
Oh.
policy, I talk about it.
Just to annoy you, there you go.
About her life and after about my life.
Just a minute,
It's
lovely.
fine.
Right.
Local.
Yes, please. Unplug and unwrap, please.
It's not, and then John feels
Right.
off with things.
Did you enjoy that, Chris?
Yes, I do.
Good, thank you.
I know.
Right, cool.
This is the worst off to get on with it. haven't you?
Always somebody worse off. You've got to live like that.
Definitely true.
Do you know, I know a really staunch Christian, right? She moans a lot, right? And I said that she's a staunch Christian. I said,
Oh, sorry.
you're moaning. How do you think Jesus Christ felt when he was nailed up on a cross?
And she went,
She wasn't too pleased.
do you know what? There's a lady in my friend in work, her little granddaughter's a year old and she got a brain tumour. And she just